Everybody loves Mulan. Disney obviously loves Mulan, so do feminists, for obvious reasons. I've seen a lot of Mulan-related posts on Tumblr that address her legacy. On the one hand, I appreciate their interest in Mulan's story and its historical context. On the other hand, however, I'm afraid to say that none of them have covered the whole story, especially the most vital part, the origin. Without mentioning where Mulan's story first came from, is it really that surprising that most of the posts are actually false in so many ways? Which is why I decided to make a two-part vlog on Mulan. In this first installment, I'd like to go back to the very beginning. Mulan was introduced to the Chinese people in two narrative poems, both named the Ballad of Mulan, assumed to be written during the Northern Wei period, and was documented in an anthology named The Ballads of Past and Present, published during the Qin Dynasty. Unfortunately, the original anthology was lost, but it has been cited in other anthologies, which explains why anyone would know this book at all. It is also why the only existing source of the Ballad of Mulan is actually another book named Anthology of the Music Bureau, published during the Northern Song Dynasty. Because it has been circulating around for such a long time, we also have good reasons to believe that the version we get to read today is at least a little bit different from its original. So Mulan's story, it's approximately 1500 years old, but we can only get to read the 1000-year-old version of it. And did I mention there were two ballads of Mulan? Yes, two poems about Mulan can be found in Anthology of the Music Bureau, but most people only know the first one. Back in middle school, the first poem was one of the core pieces of my Chinese class. I assume it still is, and we had to recite the whole thing. The second Mulan poem is less known, probably because it doesn't sound as epic as the first one, but content-wise, the two are very, very similar. Let's go through the two poems to see what Mulan's story is all about. The first poem opens with Mulan weaving by the window and sighing. Because her father was enlisted in the army, but she had no older brother to replace him. She then decided to join the army and place her father instead. She gathered all the stuff she needed and left home. She fought bravely in the battle and returned after a decade. The emperor was pleased with her service and asked her what she wanted in return. She said she didn't want anything but to be sent home. When she returned, her parents came to greet her. Her older sister and younger brother prepared themselves for her arrival. As Mulan returned to her room, she put on her old clothes and makeup before coming out to meet her fellow soldiers, who had absolutely no idea that Mulan was a woman in the dozen years that they had fought side by side. The poem ended with a quote, either from Mulan herself or the writer's point of view. And it is probably one of the most interesting endings in the history of Chinese poetry. It says, "The male rabbit would kick his feet, and the female would blink its eye. But how could you tell if I am male or female when the two are walking side by side?" The rabbit metaphor was referring to the way people tell a male rabbit from a female rabbit by picking them up by their ears. Although if you ask me, I would just look at their genitals, but anyway. Today, kicking of the feet, 扑朔, and blinking, 迷离, are joined together to form an idiom, or also known in Chinese, 成语. So 扑朔迷离, it's used to describe ambiguous circumstances. This also reminds me of a painting by my dear friend Gwenn Seemel in her book Crime Against Nature, which you should totally read, which is captioned, "It can be hard to tell them apart by just looking at them. In many species of rabbits, the female is slightly larger than the male. Among European rabbits, the opposite is true, but the difference is generally negligible. And both sexes have the same coloring." A nice coincidence, isn't it? I cannot recall another example in Chinese history that so directly challenges the idea of gender roles and ends by questioning whether men and women are really that different. The second ballad of Mulan has the exact same storyline, but it gave further explanation on why Mulan's father could not join the army, because he was old and weak. And it talked a little bit more about the hardship Mulan went through during the war. Interestingly, the second poem did not include an exchange between Mulan and the emperor. She kind of just returned home after the war, as a decorated war hero, of course. Here the poem says, As relatives gave a toast to Mulan's parents, they finally realized that having a daughter is the same as having a son. In case you were wondering what her parents were thinking at that moment. And then we also have the moment of surprise for Mulan's comrades. The poem ended in a much less profound manner by directly praising Mulan's virtues, namely her loyalty for the country and her piety for her parents. So what can we learn from these two poems? We know that Mulan has siblings, an older sister and a younger brother, so instead of Mulan, we have Mulan in the middle. Okay, that was lame, I know. We also know that Mulan was not a stereotypical tomboy. She also weaved and put on pretty makeup. But what else? I don't know if you have realized by now, but these two poems were the only source of Mulan's story. Anything else that was related to Mulan more or less derived from these two poems, including temples, monuments, and other literary work that spawned across the country in the years after the poems first came out. But poetry is not equivalent to history, right? The Ballad of Mulan is not considered a historical record, which means Mulan is a character from the Ballad of Mulan instead of an actual person. She is not real. And her alleged family name, Hua or Fa in Cantonese, well, that wasn't in the poems either. It only appeared in other works. And since Mulan literally means magnolia, is it really that much of a surprise that people assumed her last name meant flowers? Of course, writers have invented names for her whole family, as well as other last names, and some even claim they knew where her birthplace is. But none of these claims were supported by facts, so none of them could be used to prove that Mulan had really existed. But before you cry in dismay that Mulan is a fictional character, let me give you a reason why you shouldn't do that. The Ballad of Mulan has no named author, which means instead of a story written by a certain person, it was more likely to be a folk song that circulated among the common people. And considering how radical the story is, with a woman cross-dressing to fight in the war and only to reveal her true self after she returned as a war hero, I say it is unlikely that someone just invented the story out of thin air. There must have been a girl, maybe with another name, who made similar accomplishments during the war, who inspired ordinary folks to praise her in the song and celebrate her legacy. The true story may not be as fancy and epic as the poem. Nonetheless, I believe there must have been one for the ballad to come about in the first place. In Mulan Part 2, The Glass Ceiling of Ancient China, I'd like to dig deeper into the legend of Mulan and discuss what her story says about women of Ancient China. Thanks for watching, drop me a question if you have one, and I'll see you next time.